They thought one ship couldn't change the course of a war. They were wrong. When the Nemesis emerged from the void, it didn't bring a fleet. It brought a reckoning. In 36 hours, everything would burn, and the galaxy would remember why humanity is feared. The Nemesis ripped into real space, like a phantom emerging from the void in complete silence. The sheer mass of the warship displaced the void itself, its hull gleaming in the distant light of Vespera's star. No prelude, no warning, just the sudden imposing presence of an apex predator looming over the besieged colony below. In the control chamber of the occupied city center, Vedrak, the leader of the Kelzar mercenaries, watched the monitors, his sharp, predatory gaze locked onto the display as the Nemesis settled into position. His armored exoskeleton, a patchwork of reinforced plating and old plasma burns, glinted under the dim tactical lights. Twin ridges ran along his skull, framing deep-set black eyes that drank in the visuals without a hint of reflection. His mandibles twitched as he studied the warship, clawed fingers drumming against the hilt of his blade in slow, calculated movements. The fortified command room was a far cry from the sleek council halls he had seen in his years of service to warlords and politicians. Alloy barriers, reinforced with defensive plating, had been bolted over windows. Emergency power routed to defensive systems. The colony had emerged as a fortress, and yet despite all his preparations, the sight of that ship sent an unfamiliar sensation twisting in his gut. The humans had sent a single warship, not a fleet, a single massive vessel standing alone against an entire blockade. He ran a clawed hand over his mandibles and turned his attention back to the broadcast he had been delivering. The hollow feed projected his image across channels linked directly to Earth's united defense and the Galactic Council chambers. He adjusted the grip on his blade, letting its plasma edge flare to life, a bright pulsing blue against the sterile lighting of the chamber. Kelzar forces now control Vespera colony, he stated, his voice steady. Cold. Every sector is ours. The defenses are under our command. Its people live now at our mercy. He let the words settle, then stepped toward the bound figure at his feet. Chancellor Oren Kyle remained on his knees, his face bruised, blood drying along the curve of his jaw. The containment field around him flickered as the energy pulsed along its edges. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes, despite the pain, remained defiant. Vedrak crouched beside him, bringing the blade close to his cheek. If humanity wishes to remain in its seat among the Council, if you wish to maintain your foothold in the Lyra Verge in the Kesar, Expanse, and the Valen trade route, you will comply. Then he pressed the blade just enough for the heat to blister the Chancellor's skin. Turning his gaze to the feed, he declared, "You have 2 hours. After that, I will eliminate the Chancellor, and then the civilians, one by one." A heavy pause. He could imagine the effect his words would have in council chambers. The bickering politicians scrambling to distance themselves from the crisis. He had seen the way they viewed humans, upstarts, threats, anomalies. They would not intervene. They would let Earth fend for itself. In the halls of the Galactic Council, the transmission ended, leaving the gathered representatives in contemplative silence. A sawn diplomat, his elongated silken tendrils shifting lazily in the artificial gravity, twitched his antenna in mild amusement. They struggle, yet they wish to stand among us as equals, he murmured. A Zendari official, her bioluminescent scales pulsing a cool violet, tilted her head. If they cannot resolve this on their own, then perhaps they are not ready to hold a seat at this table. A few nods of agreement followed. Some members remained impassive. Others exchanged knowing glances. No orders were given. No debates ensued. Across the chamber, a hollow screen still displayed Vedrak's broadcast, but none of them were watching anymore. One counselor idly adjusted their ceremonial robes. Another tapped at a personal console, already moving on to the next matter on the agenda. Vedrak was right. The council would not interfere. A sharp buzz in his earpiece disrupted the broadcast. One of his subordinates' voice edged with unease. "Commander, you should see this." Vedrak straightened, closing the broadcast feed with a gesture. He turned toward the tactical display as his officer pulled up an external feed. The Nemesis was holding position, an unshaken monolith in the void surrounded. Waiting mercenary warships had already moved to encircle it. Interceptors hovered in tight formation, their targeting systems primed. Frigates took defensive positions, weapon ports glowing with charge. The blockade was in place, sealing off any possible escape. Yet the ship did nothing. "They're not responding to hails," the officer reported, "not returning fire." Just sitting there. Vedrak narrowed his eyes. "Fire. A warning shot. Get their attention." The orders went through. In moments, the void lit up with streaks of energy as mercenary turrets opened fire. Pulse cannons sent shimmering waves of ionized plasma across the distance, streaking toward the Nemesis like celestial spears. They struck. For a fraction of a second, the darkness was illuminated by the energy blasts, searing streaks of plasma converging upon the human warship. And then, just as quickly, they vanished and did nothing. The energy dispersed harmlessly against the warship's shields, vanishing into the emptiness as if they had never been fired at all. Across the mercenary fleet, dozens of officers stared at their consoles, waiting for damage reports. None came. The Nemesis remained still, hung in the void like a specter, its hull devoid of movement, its weapons still cold. No charge build-up, no targeting scans, just a dead, unyielding mass staring them down. Vedrak's fingers curled into a fist. Open a direct channel. No response. No interference. No static. Just silence, heavy and deafening. He bared his teeth, mandibles twitching in irritation. Try again. Nothing. The bridge crew exchanged wary glances. The comm channels registered no interference, no jamming. The humans weren't blocking transmissions, they were ignoring them. Vedrak let out a low growl, his facial ridges tensing as he paced the length of the command center. His steps were measured, but his claws clicked against the floor, an unconscious tell of unease. The hum of the hollow displays cast sharp blue light over his features. He turned back to his officer. "Send another transmission to Earth and the Council," he ordered. "Reaffirm the deadline." His gaze drifted back to the monitor where the Nemesis loomed an unmoving specter against the stars. "And find out what the hell they're waiting for." 36 hours before the Nemesis arrived at Vespera, before the silent specter of its presence loomed over the colony's skies, before the mercenaries of Kelsar felt the first stirrings of unease. Earth already knew. The transmission had come in fragmented, distorted by forced encryption breaks and emergency signal relays. The first images were choppy, a grainy overhead of smoke rising from the city center, bodies dragged into containment areas, then static, a brief flicker of motion, the battered face of Chancellor Dulé. Madripoor blood pooling beneath him as his captors stood over him, Then darkness. Inside the UED Strategic Command, the war room was deathly quiet as the footage ended. Rows of monitors cast cold blue light over the gathered officers, their uniforms crisp, their faces carved from stone. The feed looped again, but no one spoke. No one needed to. Admiral Marcus. Riven stood at the central terminal, his broad shoulders squared, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he watched the footage replay in silence. His presence alone commanded the room. The man had weathered decades of war, held the line in conflicts that had broken entire species, and yet as he looked at the still frame of Madripoor's bruised and bloodied face, something dark flickered in his eyes. A junior officer broke the silence. "Sir," this was intercepted from a direct broadcast to the council. Riven's head turned slightly, but he didn't answer. Another officer spoke. "We confirmed through secondary intelligence feeds. Vespera was taken from within. Internal sabotage coordinated. They breached primary defenses with almost no resistance." Riven exhaled slowly, and the council. Silence stretched for a beat too long. A lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "They've been informed?" A slow nod. No change in his expression. "And they still haven't contacted us." The same officer stiffened. "No, sir." Riven tapped a single command into the council, freezing the footage on Vadrak's face. The mercenary's mandibles pulled into a sneer, his blade glowing against the Chancellor's cheek. The Admiral studied the image as if committing it to memory, then simply said, "Understood." Across the war room, the murmurs began, low voices threading through the tension. Officers whispered in clipped exchanges, pulling up secondary reports, scanning orbital data. Someone swore under their breath. Another exhaled sharply, the sound barely audible beneath the quiet hum of the monitors. Riven didn't move, didn't speak. A strategist leaned in. "Sir, our analysts confirm minimal casualties in the initial assault. Civilian containment appears controlled, but that won't last. If they mean to make an example of this colony, they will." Riven cut in eyes, still on the tactical briefings, scrolling across his screen. He lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was calm. "Certain. Prepare the Nemesis." The war room didn't stir. No objections. No hesitation. The Admiral turned to his aide, a commander with sharp eyes and a name patch reading Renata Singh. "Have the Ugard and Jakovsky teams briefed and in transit within the hour. Full tactical clearance." She nodded without question. "Yes, sir." Riven's gaze lingered on the frozen frame of Vedrak one last time. Then he turned away. This was no longer a negotiation. This was war. 36 hours later, above Vespera, the Nemesis remained motionless in the void, a silent monolith staring down the blockade, encircling the colony. The fleet of Kelzar mercenaries had formed a tight perimeter, their interceptors patrolling the outer defenses, while capital ships held steady weapons primed. Yet the warship did nothing. On the bridge of the Nemesis, Admiral Marcus Riven watched the tactical displays with an expression of absolute calm. The enemy fleet's formation had settled into a predictable rhythm, pacing, circling, waiting. They had fired warning shots. They had hailed. Nothing had changed. A new transmission came through, patched from the enemy command center. The officer at the comm station hesitated. "Sir, incoming demand for response." Same encryption key. Riven didn't glance away from the monitors. Ignore it. The officer complied, muting the signal. The bridge remained silent except for the hum of system readouts and the low chatter of technical staff relaying battlefield telemetry. Riven pressed a control on the main console, switching to a secure channel. His voice was low, steady. A guard. Vex. What's your position? A brief pause. Then through the encrypted frequency, two voices were in, said Captain Elias Ward. His voice was clipped, professional. Same here. Followed Major Ronan Vex, barely above a whisper. Riven gave the smallest nod. Good. The infiltrators were inside, below the surface of Vespera, deep within the colony's subterranean infrastructure. A guard led his squad through a series of maintenance tunnels. The four men moved in a staggered formation, weapons raised, steps silent. The air was heavy with the scent of damp metal and coolant leaks. The dim glow of emergency lighting barely illuminated the tunnels. A guard flicked two fingers forward, signaling his team to advance. Behind him, Sergeant Cole Danner covered the rear, his expression grim beneath the glare of his visor. The other two operatives, Lieutenant Nira Solon and Corporal Felix Dre, moved in sync, their rifles steady. A faint vibration pulsed through the floor, the distant thrum of the colony's energy grid. A guard tapped his comm, approaching primary shield control. No resistance yet. Riven's voice responded through his earpiece. Proceed. Above them, hidden within the skeletal underbelly of Vespera's orbital docks, Vex and his team slithered through access shafts and maintenance corridors. Their path was slower, more methodical. The docking bay was still operational, with mercenary patrols moving in tight formations between refueling ships. Sergeant Ty Lorick pressed against the bulkhead, scanning the route ahead. We've got movement along the catwalks. Two guards, lightly armed. Vex barely nodded. We go silent. With a swift, coordinated movement, the team advanced. Private Zane Harrow slipped into the shadows, a blade flashing in the dim light. The first mercenary dropped without a sound. The second turned, just in time to meet Vex's sidearm pressed against his temple. One suppressed shot. The body crumpled. The squad kept moving. Inside the occupied command center of Vespera, Vedrak paced before the main holo display, his mandibles clicking with irritation. They still haven't responded, he growled. His comm officer shifted uncomfortably. No, sir. No response, no transmissions, no movement. Vedrak bared his teeth. They're posturing. They want us to think they're calculating something, but it's a bluff. One of his lieutenants, a burly reptilian warrior, spoke up. If they were going to attack, they would have by now. Exactly. Vedrak gestured to the screen where the Nemesis hung motionless. They want us to flinch. Humans are reckless, always playing against the odds. But they are alone. We have an entire fleet. A mercenary technician hesitated before speaking. Sir, there are anomalies in our surveillance grid. Vedrak turned sharply. Explain. The technician shifted, nervous. Minor inconsistencies. Security cameras flickering between active and offline across different sectors. Power readings fluctuating in areas that should be stable. Motion sensors detecting movement where no patrols are assigned. Another technician, older, more experienced, exhaled through his nostrils. If it is, it's the worst timing I've ever seen, Vedrak snarled. Or it could be something else. Sweep the perimeter, recalibrate the scans. If this is some pathetic human trick, I want to know now. He turned back toward the holofeed, still transmitting to Earth and the Galactic Council. "This is their last chance to surrender," he declared, "or we start to empty this colony." He gestured to a pair of his guards. "Take the Chancellor to the holding cells. Lock him up. He'll need his strength to die on his feet." Dule Madrapur was hauled to his knees first, then forced upright. His body battered, but his resolve strong. His breath came fast and uneven, pain lacing every movement. But his stare remained steady. Defiant. The restraints bit into his wrists, yet he gave no reaction. Even as they forced him from the room, even as agony pulsed through his body, his eyes burned with the same fire. Vedrak did not acknowledge it. His focus was elsewhere now. Something was wrong, and he was going to find out what. The air in the underground tunnels of Vespera was damp, thick with the metallic tang of coolant leaks and the distant hum of active generators. Captain Elias Ward led his team through the narrow corridors, his footsteps barely making a sound against the reinforced flooring. He moved with trained efficiency, his rifle raised, his breathing steady. Behind him, Sergeant Cole Danner covered the rear eyes, scanning each dimly lit passage for the slightest sign of movement. Lieutenant Nira Solon, the team's engineer, moved just ahead of Corporal Felix Dre, his wrist-mounted hacking device flickering with data streams. Every so often, Solon paused to run a diagnostic sweep, not just for security nodes, but for power fluctuations that might reveal hidden traps. "Hold," Ward murmured, raising a fist. The team froze. Ahead, the tunnel branched in two directions, one leading toward the colony's auxiliary energy grid, the other to an old maintenance bay that had long been abandoned. Emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting erratic shadows that twisted with every shift of motion. Solon crouched beside Ward, glancing at his scanner. "Something's off," he whispered. "Security locks along this route were disengaged recently." "Sabotage," Dre muttered. "Or cooperation," Ward replied, voice tight. His mind pieced it together instantly. The mercenaries hadn't broken into the system with brute force, they had help. Someone inside had been forced to compromise the colony's defenses, likely through blackmail or threats. The precision of it only reinforced how well orchestrated this operation had been. His eyes narrowed. "We move. Silent if possible." The team advanced with renewed caution. They weren't alone down here. Just ahead, the muted sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnels. A patrol ward signaled Rami, and Dre melted into the shadows, pressing against the cold metal walls. Solon crouched behind an exposed ventilation pipe, fingers brushing over his suppressed pistol. Two mercenaries rounded the corner, their rifles slung low, casual, unaware. Dre shifted first, silent, and measured. He moved behind the nearest mercenary, his blade sliding cleanly between the armor plating at the base of the neck. The man dropped without a sound. The second mercenary turned too fast. Rami lunged, but the enemy managed to let out a sharp grunt, fumbling for his weapon. Ward reacted instantly, his suppressed rifle coughing once. The shot punched into the mercenary's chest, slamming him backward into the wall. Silence settled again. Sloppy Ward muttered under his breath. He knelt beside the bodies, dragging them into the maintenance bay. Solon tapped his wrist console, overriding the nearest security node with a flick of his fingers. The access logs flashed across his screen. This lock had been disengaged only cycles ago. A soft beep confirmed the door locks resetting behind them. "Move," Ward ordered. They pressed on, while Ward's team pressed forward underground. Vex's unit maneuvered through the upper docks. Major Ronan Vex pressed his back against a bulkhead, raising a fist in a hard stop. His breath was slow, controlled, barely misting in the cold station air. His team froze instantly, A faint shuffle echoed down the catwalk ahead. A patrol. Noah Lorik moved like a wraith. Weight evenly distributed as he listened, head tilting slightly to gauge the sound. He lifted 2 fingers, 2 hostiles, then pointed left, an approaching blind spot. Vex gave a subtle nod. Lycoharos slipped ahead. A shadow in the dim light. His blade whispered through the air, one clean strike between vertebrae. The mercenary sagged, breath never leaving his lips. The second guard barely had time to react before Vex's silenced pistol fired once. A neat, smoking hole appeared in the mercenary's throat. He staggered, then dropped without a sound. Clear Lorik muttered. Emre Sadek crouched at a maintenance panel, the glow of his wrist pad flickering against his face. His hands worked swiftly, navigating security logs and slipping past encrypted locks with methodical ease. The station's surveillance network sprawled before him in cascading lines of code. His hands stopped. No active cameras, no alarms. He whispered. Vex narrowed his eyes. That's not right. Sadek scanned again, his lips pressing into a thin line. It's intentional. These doors weren't just unlocked. They were left open, Victor. Valverde knelt beside them, a charge already in his gloved hand, thumb hovering over the trigger. His dark eyes flicked to Vex. That's not coincidence. Vex's jaw tightened. Inside help. Sadek hesitated, more like forced help. His voice lowered. I've seen this before. Someone was compromised. This isn't hacking. It's submission. Valverde muttered a curse in Spanish. That means they know we're coming. Vex didn't hesitate. He signaled forward. Maybe, but doesn't change the mission. They moved inside the command center. Vedrak's patience was unraveling. The reports coming in were disjointed, systems flickering offline for ticks at a time before coming back, doors unlocking without command input, cameras losing feed. Sur-sector alarms in the maintenance corridors have been disabled. Vedrak turned sharply, eyes narrowing. By whom? Silenced. The technician swallowed hard, hesitating before answering. Unknown, sir. We're running diagnostics, but someone is inside. Vedrak hissed, slamming a fist against the console. The crew stiffened. The leader of Kelsar narrowed his eyes, thinking. He had underestimated the humans before assuming they'd come in guns blazing. But they weren't storming the colony with ships and artillery. They were already here. He straightened his voice, sharp. Send squads to sweep the tunnels and docks. I want every unauthorized access point checked. Now. A murmur of confirmation spread through the command center as orders were relayed. Vedrak exhaled, mandibles clicking together in thought. And then there was still the Nemesis, motionless, silent, watching. They were playing a game he didn't understand yet. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his blade, but he would. And when he did, he would burn this entire colony down. Beneath the colony, Ward's team reached the central power grid. The chamber was large, reinforced walls lined with thermal conduits and thick cables feeding into the colony's primary reactors. Adams moved immediately, setting up a small console to access the grid's control systems. Give me 30 ticks. Ward took up position near the entrance. Rifle raised. You've got 20. Calder slipped into the shadows, knife drawn. If any mercenaries wandered into this room, they wouldn't leave. Sasha worked fast, navigating the interface swiftly. Rami kept his back to the wall, scanning their surroundings. Almost there, Sasha muttered, just need to. A red light blinked on his console. Wait, he froze. Something's. A distant thud echoed through the tunnels. Rami stiffened. Contact footsteps multiple. Fast Ward gritted his teeth. We're out of time. Solon Sasha finished linking the sabotage devices to the main grid, his voice tight. Ready when you are. A guard's lips curled into something close to a grin. Then let's make sure they never see it coming. The air in the lower levels of the orbital docks was thick with sweat, blood, and the stale scent of fear. Vex moved with lethal precision, leading his team deeper into the heart of the mercenaries' makeshift prison. The mercenaries had repurposed the facility into a makeshift prison with reinforced blast doors and hastily installed containment fields. The glow of red emergency lighting flickered along the curved metal walls, throwing shifting shadows across the floor. Lorik signaled ahead. 2 guards stationed near an intersection, rifles slung low, their stances casual. They weren't expecting an intrusion. Vex didn't hesitate. He raised his sidearm and 2 silence shots punched through the air, finding their marks in the guards' throats. Their bodies crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Sadek moved in his wrist pad, already scanning the security grid. No alarms triggered. We're still dark. Harrow and Valverde flanked the doorway to the detention block. Harrow pressed his ear against the cold steel, listening. He lifted 3 fingers, 3 hostiles inside. Vex gave a short nod. No need for words. Lorik moved first, disengaging the door's manual override. The moment the panels hissed open, Valverde tossed a flash grenade inside. A burst of white light illuminated the chamber, followed by the sharp crack of disoriented shouts. They stormed in. Vex took the first merc in the chest with a suppressed burst, sending him sprawling against the control console. Harrow's blade flashed, severing the tendons of another's wrist before the mercenary could even lift his rifle. A final shot from Lorik put the last guard down before he could cry for help, then silence. Sadek was already at the console, systems still clear, no external alerts. Vex turned his attention to the cells. The metal holding pens were crude, but effective. Some contained civilians, pale, wide-eyed figures pressed against the back walls. Others held alien prisoners, their expressions hardened with resignation. And in the farthest containment field, Chancellor Dule Kael. The man was slumped against the energy barrier, his breathing shallow, his once pristine robes now blood-stained and torn. His shoulders barely moved, as if even the act of drawing breath was an effort. The field cast a faint blue glow over his gaunt face, highlighting the fresh bruises along his jaw, the dried blood caking the side of his temple. But as Vex stepped closer, the Chancellor's eyes snapped open with the presence of the Marine. Sharp alert. Vex knelt beside the control panel, working quickly. "Sir, we're getting you out." Kael's voice was rough, cracked from dehydration. "You're late." Vex smirked. Traffic was hell. He disabled the containment field and the barrier fizzled out. Valverde moved in, catching the Chancellor before he could collapse. "We've got you," Valverde murmured. Harrow was already unlocking the other cells. No time to separate them, everyone moves together. Vex helped Kael to his feet. "Can you walk?" "With assistance," the Chancellor admitted. Lorik tapped his comms. "Sir, we've got a movement." "Patrol incoming." Vex cursed. "Time's up, move." Deep beneath the colony, Ward crouched behind an old ventilation unit, scanning the narrow corridors ahead. The auxiliary energy grid was secured, but his mission wasn't over yet. The colonists needed to act now. A small group of civilians huddled in the shadows near him, eyes darting anxiously toward the distant echoes of boot falls. Among them was Logan Cade, a former security officer, now reduced to hiding like the rest. His grip tightened around the battered pistol in his hands. "They won't give us another chance," Ward said, voice low. "We hit now, while they're still disoriented. You take the north corridor, secure the command station. We'll handle the main security post." Cade hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Ward scanned their group. Hardened miners, factory workers, engineers, not soldiers. But they had the one advantage that mattered. They were fighting for their home. Solon relayed the final override command, and the system lit up green. The colony's internal defenses were now compromised. Ward keyed his comms. "You're clear to engage." A heartbeat later, chaos erupted. Vadrak's clawed fingers drummed against the control panel as a series of muted alarms flickered across his display. No direct threats. Yet. But something was happening. He turned to his second-in-command, narrowing his eyes. Status report. The mercenary shifted uneasily. Scattered disturbances. Reports of internal sabotage. Localized system failures. We're investigating. Vadrak's gaze snapped to the tactical holodisplay, scanning for any sign of movement. The Nemesis remained still. Silent. The ship wasn't attacking, but the colony was turning against them. His mandibles twitched with irritation. Dispatch reinforcements to the detention level. Double security in the command stations. If the humans are making a move, I want to know now. Vex's team moved fast, guiding Kyle and the other prisoners through the underbelly of the station. The hallways were too exposed. They needed to reach a secure point before reinforcements arrived. The first shots rang out before they reached the secondary exit. A group of mercenaries rounded the corner, rifles raised. Harrow shoved a prisoner to the ground just as the air cracked with energy. Bolts, Vex, and Lorik dropped into cover, returning fire. The confined space turned the exchange into a deadly crossfire. Harrow took out one with a shot to the gut. Valverde's rifle barked, cutting down another before the mercenaries could rally. Vex's voice was steel. "Fall back. Move them." Sadek ducked low, guiding Kale behind a stack of cargo crates. The Chancellor grimaced but kept moving. Lorik's rifle clicked empty. More incoming. Harrow didn't hesitate. He grabbed a dead Merc's grenade belt, yanking a pin free and hurling it into the corridor. The explosion rocked the station shrapnel, tearing through the reinforcements. A break in the fire. Vex seized the moment. Go now. They pushed forward, hauling Kyle and the prisoners through a maintenance hatch, the blast door sealed behind them. For now, they were safe. Vex tapped his comms. Objective secured. Riven's voice came through calm as ever. Status on the Chancellor. Vex glanced at Kale. The man was weak but alive. He'll make it. Kale exhaled, gripping Vex's sleeve. They had help. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but the words cut through the noise like a blade. His eyes locked onto Vex's, raw with exhaustion but unwavering. From inside the council, he swallowed, gathering what little strength he had left. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly what to take, exactly what to ask. His voice dropped lower, realization setting in Valen trade route wasn't mentioned outside the council. Vex's breath stilled. The pieces shifted. This wasn't just a mercenary operation. This was something bigger. In the tunnels, Ward received the confirmation. His jaw clenched as he checked his weapon. The battle was far from over. He turned to Cade, nodding toward the distant sounds of gunfire. "Let's finish this." The bridge of the Nemesis was silent. The kind of silence that precedes destruction. Admiral Marcus Riven stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze locked on the tactical displays before him. Every detail of the battlefield was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. The infiltration teams had completed their objectives. The mercenaries were losing control. And Vedrak, arrogant, overconfident, Vedrak still hadn't realized that he had already lost. A junior officer turned from his console, voice steady, despite the tension in the air. "Sir, confirmation from both teams. The Chancellor is secure. Sabotage protocols are in place." Riven nodded once. "Open the channel." The officer entered the command. Across the occupied colony, screens flickered to static. Enemy comms went silent, slicing through the silence with razor-sharp clarity. A single voice filled the airwaves. "This is Admiral Marcus Riven of the HSS Nemesis." A pause, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "Your time is up. Surrender now. And maybe you walk out of this colony." His tone carried just enough sarcasm to cut deep. The message reverberated through the mercenary fleet, through the occupied control stations, through every corner of Vespera, still under enemy control. Inside the fortified command center of Vespera, Vedrak's mandibles twitched, his clawed fingers curled into a fist. The Nemesis had been silent for so long, waiting, watching. He had convinced himself it was hesitation that the humans were stalling, that they were outmatched. But the moment Riven spoke, it hit him like a plasma blast to the chest. They had never been waiting. They had been hunting, and he had been their prey from the start. Vedrak whirled toward his officers. All ships opened fire, hit them with everything. The order went through instantly, but it was already too late. Because the Nemesis had moved. The human warship, which had remained an unyielding specter in the void, now surged forward. The first enemy frigate in its path didn't even have time to adjust before a bolt of searing energy from the Nemesis's forward cannons ripped through its hull, slicing through the ship as if it were paper. A second smaller vessel attempted to break formation, only to be obliterated by the Yeb's dorsal turrets, which cut it apart mid-turn. Then, the fighter bays opened. A swarm of human interceptors streaked from the belly of the Nemesis, their black hulls gleaming under the artificial light of Vespera's orbit. They moved in perfect coordination, slipping between the larger mercenary warships, like predators carving through prey. The Kelzar fleet was in disarray. Vedrak's officers scrambled for control, issuing conflicting orders as their formations collapsed under the human onslaught. Riven's voice cut through the comms again, cold, measured. "We gave you a choice." He barely finished the sentence. On the ground, Ward heard the transmission. His grip on his rifle tightened, a slow grin creeping onto his face. "That's our cue." Solon was already finishing the final security override. A soft beep confirmed the systems were ready. Ward keyed his comm, executing. With a flick of Solon wrist, the sabotage was complete. The colony's defenses collapsed. Across the occupied city, the power grids flickered as control systems overloaded. Automated turrets, once locked onto any human movement, sputtered and fell silent. Some sparked erratically, turning on their own operators before shutting down completely. Blast doors, reinforced by mercenary code locks, slid open with an eerie finality. And just like that, the tide turned. Gunfire ripped through the streets. Mercenaries who had spent hours holding the colony in a stranglehold found themselves suddenly outnumbered. The city erupted. Screams echoed through the streets. Civilians, once cowering in their homes, now swarmed like a tide of vengeance. Engineers pried rifles from dead mercenaries' hands, their grips shaking but steady. Miners swung plasma cutters in brutal arcs, carving through armor as if it were scrap metal. And in the heart of it all, Logan Cade led a group of former security officers in retaking a command post, their once stolen weapons now aimed at the mercenaries who had thought them defenseless. A guard moved through the chaos with his team, methodical and relentless. A mercenary rounded the corner ahead. A guard dropped him with a single shot. Another took cover behind an overturned supply crate. Dre flanked left, cutting him down before he could react. Rami launched a fragmentation grenade over a barricade, sending a squad of mercs sprawling as the explosion tore through them. The city was burning, but it was their city again. Inside his command center, Vedrak was seething. "This isn't possible," he snarled, watching as more red markers blinked out on the tactical display. Entire sectors were falling. The fleet was crumbling. The ground forces were overwhelmed. One of his officers turned, face pale. "Sir, we need to retreat." Vedrak slammed his claw against the console, sparks flying from the impact. "No, not yet. Focus all remaining firepower on the Nemesis. It won't work. Do it." Orders relayed. The remnants of the Kelsar fleet adjusted course, all remaining capital ships turning their weapons toward the human warship. But Riven had anticipated this. The Nemesis veered sharply, closing the distance. It was too fast, too precise. The enemy ships had assumed it was a slow-moving dreadnought. But they had underestimated human engineering. Before the first barrage could even land, the Nemesis slid into position. Broadside batteries roared. A mercenary destroyer took the full brunt of the impact. Its shields collapsed instantly, its hulls shearing apart in a cascade of metal and fire. Another frigate attempted to retreat. Torpedoes from the Nemesis launch bays found it first punching through its engines and ripping it in half. The battlefield was a massacre. Vedrak knew it. His second-in-command swallowed hard. "Sir, if we don't leave now, there won't be anything left." Vedrak's claws trembled. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Not like this. His mandibles clicked. In frustration, his mind racing for a way out, but there was none. He had already lost, and now he had to run. "Pull back," he growled. "All forces fall back to the emergency extraction points." His officers scrambled, relaying the orders. Across the battlefield, mercenary ships began breaking formation, attempting to flee. But the humans weren't going to let them. Riven's voice came through the comms once more. "You don't get to walk away from this." And the Nemesis advanced. On the ground, the last holdouts of the mercenary forces were falling back, but there was nowhere to run. Colonists had overtaken key positions. Every alleyway, every street was a death trap. A guard moved with his squad through the smoke-choked air, clearing the last enemy stronghold near the central plaza. Bodies littered the ground. Some mercenaries surrendered. Others fought. To the last breath, Cade and his security officers secured the perimeter. "This sector is ours." A guard nodded. "Good." He keyed his comm. "Riven, the city is ours." There was a long silence. Then, "Well done, Marine." A guard exhaled. Then he checked his rifle. Because the job wasn't over yet. Somewhere Vadrak was still alive, and a guard intended to fix that. On orbit by the plasma cannons and turrets of the Nemesis. The sky above Vespera burned. Mercenary ships twisted and lurched through space. Their once disciplined formations reduced to panicked, fragmented retreats. The Nemesis shattered their lines, turning the battlefield into a kill zone. Admiral Riven watched the chaos unfold with cold precision. The tactical holo map displayed red markers, enemy vessels attempting to flee, while blue markers, his squadrons, moved in perfect synchronization to cut off their escape. A comm officer turned. "Sir, enemy fleet is trying to regroup outside the gravity well." Riven's expression didn't change. "Block every exit. Full engagement authorization." The Nemesis batteries roared. Another enemy cruiser exploded its midsection, torn apart by a concentrated barrage. The wreckage spiraled through the void debris, scattering like shrapnel. Fighter squadrons danced through the destruction, intercepting mercenary vessels desperately attempting to make a break for hyperspace. On the bridge of a failing Kelsar destroyer, its captain's voice cracked over an open channel laced with panic. "Vadrak, we can't hold. We need an exit vector." A violent explosion cut the transmission short. Riven keyed into the fleet-wide broadcast. "No one leaves, but as a prisoner." Vadrak slammed his fist against the console, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The walls of his command center shook as distant detonations rattled through the city. His fleet was crumbling, his ground forces falling apart, and the Nemesis was relentless. Yet he still had one final move. His claws raced across the interface, bringing up the Tarek detonation protocol, a last resort. If he couldn't keep the colony, he would bury it in fire. He snarled, opening a transmission across all channels. "Humans, you think you've won, then you can inherit nothing but ashes. I'll burn this colony to the ground before I let you take it back." He activated the detonation sequence. Nothing happened. The console blinked red. System override. Vadrak's mandibles twitched. He tried again. Access denied. His blood ran cold. Then, a new voice came through his earpiece, one he did not recognize, but hated instantly, looking for something. Vadrak stiffened. "Captain Elias Ward." The human's voice was calm, deliberate, mocking. "You really thought we'd let you keep your little trump card?" Vadrak's claws trembled over the console. The Tarek charges were already neutralized. The humans had played him from the start. For the first time, real fear took hold. A guard lowered his comm, his rifle snapping up as another mercenary leaned from a balcony, firing wildly. A single precise shot from a guard's rifle sent the body tumbling to the street below. The battle had shifted completely. The mercenaries were no longer an occupying force. They were rats in a burning house. Some fought viciously, refusing to admit defeat. Others tried to run only to be cut down by coordinated human fire. The civilians were everywhere now, moving through the ruined streets like a rising tide. Engineers held plasma torches like weapons. Security officers had taken back their command posts, and miners wielded industrial tools like executioners. Logan Cade moved through the wreckage with his team, his once quiet demeanor now a hardened mask of focus. South Sector secured. He reported, his voice flat calm amidst the chaos. A guard barely heard him. His focus was ahead, where a cluster of mercenaries had barricaded themselves in a broken plaza, using overturned vehicles as makeshift cover. Dre ducked beside him, reloading. They're not moving, holding position. They're stalling. A guard muttered. He could feel it. These weren't soldiers trying to win a battle. They were desperate men, buying time. Then the first mortar hit. A plume of fire and debris erupted from a nearby street as an enemy artillery position opened fire. A guard's visor flared with proximity alerts. "They still have artillery," Rami shouted. A guard's mind worked fast. If the mercs were digging in instead of retreating, it meant something. A last stand, maybe, or an extraction point. A shout behind him drew his attention. He turned just in time to see one of his men go down. Private Reese Calder, hit in the side, blood pouring between his fingers. His breathing was sharp, eyes wide with shock. Dre cursed, already moving to help. A guard's fingers curled tighter around the trigger. If he stayed, he could stabilize Calder, maybe get him to a secured med point. But if he pushed forward, he could break the last enemy stronghold and end this. For a split second, the battle stretched in slow motion before him. The choice wasn't easy. It never was. Calder hit the ground hard. Pain detonated through his ribs, hot, sharp, drowning. His vision blurred, black, creeping at the edges. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. This was it. The battlefield around him felt distant. Gunfire shouting the distant roar of orbital cannons, all of it fading into a dull, suffocating haze. He had seen men die like this before. He had watched it happen. But not today. Not him. With a choked, shuddering breath, Calder gritted his teeth and forced himself up, one hand clutching his side, fingers slick with his own blood. His legs trembled, his vision swam, his body screamed at him to stop. He didn't. He reached down, tearing open the emergency seal on his uniform. His fingers found the compact nanobandage standard issue sewn into every Marine's gear. He slapped it onto the wound, feeling the microscopic mesh weave into his skin, sealing the injury and dulling the pain in ticks. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. The plaza was chaos, mercenaries breaking rank, human forces closing in. The battle was shifting, but he couldn't stop. He saw Ward ahead moving fast, clearing a path through the remnants of enemy forces. Calder. The voice cut through the haze. A command, a lifeline. He blinked, forcing the world into focus. A guard was looking at him. "You good?" Calder swallowed, forcing the words past clenched teeth. "No, but I'll live." A guard held his gaze for half a second, then gave a nod. Then keep up. Above them, the sky burned. The final remnants of Vadrak's fleet were desperately trying to break free. The mercenary flagship, a war cruiser twice the size of the Nemesis, but battered limping, led the escape formation. Its thrusters flared as it attempted to jump. The Nemesis saw it coming. Riven watched without emotion as his weapons officer spoke. "Sir, enemy flagship, attempting hyperspace jump." Riven gave a single nod. "Deny them." The Nemesis fired its main cannons. The first barrage gutted the ship's shield generators, sending arcs of energy surging through its failing systems. The second barrage tore through its engines, igniting fuel reserves that erupted like miniature suns. The final shot punched through the heart of the vessel, splitting it apart with a soundless explosion that sent flaming wreckage tumbling into the void. Vadrak's last escape route was gone. His forces were trapped, and Vespera belonged to humanity again. Inside the command center, Vadrak's mind raced. His fleet was gone. His ground forces in ruins, his last contingency useless. He was alone. Except no, not yet. He turned sharply to his officers. Initiate final extraction. I'm leaving. A stunned silence. His second-in-command, battered, bleeding, stepped forward, sir. The men, Vedrak, didn't even let him finish. His claws moved fast, grabbing his officer's sidearm and firing point-blank into his skull. The body crumpled. Vedrak turned to the others. Anyone else? No one spoke. Cowards, weaklings. He stormed toward the hidden evac tunnel, opening a direct channel to his private transport team. Prep the ship. Now, on the battlefield, Ward saw it. The last enemy position was breaking. Mercs were fleeing, their weapons discarded in the dirt, but Ward's eyes locked onto one figure, running in the opposite direction, not toward the escape routes, but toward a concealed structure. His instinct screamed. That's him, he growled. Levesque blinked. Who Ward was already moving Vedrak. The smell of burning metal and ozone filled the streets of Vespera. Gunfire had faded into sporadic bursts, but the battle wasn't over yet. Ward ducked behind cover, keying his comm. Vex, come in. The response came immediately tense but focused. Go Vedrak's moving hangar, east quadrant. He's trying to run. A brief silence. Then Vex's voice sharpened. Understood. I'll meet you there. Vex turned to his men, his gaze sweeping the battlefield. The resistance had gained control, but pockets of mercenary holdouts still fought desperately. He tapped his comm. Harrow, stay with Kyle. Make sure he gets to evac, Harrow. Nodded, shifting position to cover the injured Chancellor. Understood. Vex turned to Lorik and Sadek. You two. Cover Team 1's advance. Keep them moving. Lorik grinned, tightening his grip on his rifle. We got it. Sadek gave a sharp nod, already moving into position. With that, settled Vex sprinted through the wreckage, heading straight for the hangar where Ward was waiting, and where Vedrak would make his last mistake. The roar of engines filled the underground hangar as Vedrak sprinted toward his last chance at survival. His personal transport, a sleek customized vessel meant for emergency extractions, hummed with power, the engines glowing a deep crimson as they warmed up for launch. The noise of battle echoed in the distance, but he ignored it. The colony was lost. His fleet was gone, but he would escape. Everything else, his men, his reputation, his failed mission meant nothing if he could still live. He slammed his fist against the control panel, opening the boarding ramp as he climbed in, his mandibles twitching with anticipation. The ship's system booted up, flashing sequence checks as it prepared for takeoff. He could still slip away. The humans were fast, but he was faster. Then gunfire. A sharp crack, crack, crack shattered through the chaos. Sparks erupted from the engine casing, and a warning klaxon blared across the cockpit. Vedrak's mandibles parted in shock and rage. Outside, Ward and Jakovsky emerged from the smoke. Weapons raised, Ward's rifle was still aimed at the ship's thrusters, smoke curling from the barrel. Going somewhere. Ward's voice cut through the thick, smoke-filled air. Vedrak snarled, drawing his sidearm. He fired off a rapid burst, forcing the humans to take cover behind a cargo container. The ground sizzled where his plasma rounds hit, leaving deep scorch marks. Jakovsky moved first, rolling out of cover and firing a precise shot. The round slammed into Vedrak's shoulder, forcing him to stumble back, his sidearm clattering to the ground. Ward moved in fast. Before Vedrak could react, Ward was on him. He drove his shoulder into the mercenary commander's chest. knocking him backward into the hull of his own ship. Vedrak roared, swinging wildly with his uninjured arm, but Ward dodged with ease. Then Jakovsky landed the final blow. The butt of his rifle cracked against the side of Vedrak's head. The alien's body sagged, his legs giving out. He slumped against the side of the ship, conscious, but defeated. Jakovsky exhaled. That was disappointing. Ward rolled his shoulders, stepping forward as he holstered his weapon. Honestly, I expected more. Vedrak wheezed, his mandibles twitching with rage. But there was nothing left for him to do. He had lost, completely. Jakovsky dragged Vedrak up the mercenary, offering no resistance. There was nowhere left to run. The battle was won. The city stood scarred, but free. Smoke curled from the ruins. The last echoes of gunfire had faded. Logan Cade stood with his team surveying the wreckage. Civilians moved through the rubble, tending to the wounded, securing captured mercenaries, and checking for survivors. Some wept. Others stood in quiet shock. It was finally over. In the distance, a fleet of UED support vessels began landing, deploying relief teams and military personnel to secure the colony. And then the Nemesis arrived. Descending through the sky like a silent executioner, the massive warship cast a shadow over the battlefield, its sheer presence a reminder of what had just happened. Riven stepped onto the ruined streets of Vespera, his boots crunching against scorched debris. His eyes swept over the scene with the calm, detached gaze of a man who had seen this too many times before. Vedrak, bound and bloodied, was dragged forward by Vex and Ward. Riven's expression remained unreadable as he studied the alien before him. "You and I both know," he said, voice even. "You didn't act alone." Vedrak's mandibles twitched. "Someone on the council made this happen." Riven continued his tone, betraying not anger but certainty. For a moment it seemed like Vedrak would speak. His jaw shifted, his posture tensed. Then he laughed, a deep guttural sound, and said nothing. Riven held his gaze for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "Take him." Vex and Ward hauled him toward the landing zone, where a prison transport waited. Vedrak didn't look back. Nearby, Duli. Madripur was placed inside a temporary medical transport, medics already working to stabilize him. The Chancellor was weak but alive, his face still streaked with dried blood. Cade and his security officers helped civilians clear the last of the debris, while others raised what remained of the colony's flag over the central plaza. And then Calder stumbled forward, bloodied, barely standing but alive. Vex glanced at him, then at Ward. "Your guy's insane." Ward chuckled, patting Calder's shoulder. "Yeah, he is." Riven turned to face his soldiers. Ward, Vex, the ones who fought and bled for this mission. They were filthy, exhausted, and victorious Nicework Marines. Riven said simply, his voice steady. He adjusted his gloves, glancing toward the sky. "Now, prepare for the next mission. No ceremony, no grand speeches, just the next battle, waiting on the horizon. The war wasn't over, and Earth wasn't done yet." "Hey there again."